Welcome back or welcome to the Next Level Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Harris. And as always, we are brought to you by Apex Performance, the leading training program for the security leader in the security industry by security leaders for security leaders. And I'm super excited, speaking of security leaders, to be joined today by Kyle Walsh. Kyle, I'll let you kind of give your background, but I just want to give a little bit of context, kind of how we've gotten to know each other. I think we've been, through GSX, ASIS, a lot of the different. We've flown in similar circles, but
hmm
kind of a couple years ago, got to know each other when you were working at a company that used the services of the company that I was with at the time, and we got to do some really unique, interesting collaborations around how we were driving our product, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But really, really stoked to have you on, man. And thanks for coming. So maybe start off, tell us a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into the security industry, and what you've been up to recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for having me on. I think it's been quite an interesting journey through my career, and I definitely have a little bit of an unusual path to how I've gotten where I am. But I joke around when I say this, but I actually mean it. Is that I owe my entire career to Craigslist, and so I'll kind of go back to that a little bit. I went to school at Cal State Long Beach for criminal justice. Graduated in 2010, I believe it was. Was really gung ho about becoming a police officer. I thought that was going to be what I wanted to do. Interned with the LAPD and went, I don't think this is what I want to do at all. Was always really interested in wanting to protect people and protect companies or just be the protective atmosphere is something I've been
Mm.
really interested in being a part of. And so, it seemed like private security was a really natural fit for me. Was working at a bank at the time when I graduated college, and like I said, found out through the hard way that I didn't want to be a police officer anymore, and had a midlife crisis in my 20s. And I was going, uh, it was luckily I was able to find a job as an open source intelligence analyst at a little company called NC4, which has since been acquired by Everbridge and has exploded in terms of how their usefulness has impacted Fortune 500 companies and the big three letter agencies in so many different ways. And I really fell in love with that work. I
Yeah.
was really interested in finding out what was happening around the world, sifting through the noise, if you will, and being able to provide that to organizations that needed that information. I was there through the I think MH370 flight that disappeared. I was there through the
Mm.
Boston bombing, the Boston
Wow.
Marathon bombing, which was really interesting and tragic. But kind of sifting through the chaos, if you will, was something I really thrived in. And being able to find the facts and find that information to give to leaders was something I really fell in love with. One thing kind of led to another from there. I skipped the part about Craigslist.
Yeah,
I
I was
found
gonna
that job
ask.
on Craigslist. Yeah, so I found that job on Craigslist while I was sitting at the bank I was working at, being miserable with my job, and found a post for a night analyst job, and was working 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. 5 days a week, and became a vampire. But really did fall in love with that work, and so did that for a year and a half or so before my manager then told me that he was leaving and going to a little company called Google. And he said, "Hey, I think you'd be really, really good at this company, and you should come up with me." And so I did. I went from doing open source analyst work to working in a GSOC, which the rest of my career has very much been very GSOC oriented since
Mm.
then. Spent time there, kind of moving my way up from ground level analyst to kind of a shift supervisor, and then moved over to Meta, where I was a kind of a half program manager, half project manager. It was then known as Facebook at the time. So if I say Facebook, forgive me. And really, really fell in love with the work even more there. I was able to land a couple of really interesting initiatives, including the employee safety check program, which is something they've since productized through their workplace module that they
Hmm.
sell to organizations, right? So in times of crisis, right, you can reach out to employees. That was all done through their systems. As well as helping run the crisis response program there, which was surfacing intelligence-based information onto the actual Facebook platform itself, so that users could mark themselves as safe, offer blood donations,
Mm.
goods donations. We were able to help hundreds of millions of users mark safe, and all that work was done through the GSOC in terms of
Wow.
finding out that information, making sure that there was sources of truth, no fake news, if you will, to have that be really accurate. Um, that's really what got my interest and love going around ensuring that security departments as a whole were being viewed as business enablers and not just cost centers, right? No secret between you and I that security organizations are cost centers, right? We end up spending a ton of money, and for good reason, as long as it's done appropriately. But to leadership, that can be a tough sell, right? If you're asking for millions of dollars and you're not able to show really strong ROI metrics on that, then what do you do? And so, if you're able to actually influence the business itself, especially from a social good standpoint and being able to move the needle forward that way, much easier to get resources. Not saying that's the only reason we did that, of course, but it was a nice benefit. And obviously being able to help people is super important. From there, went to a little startup where I met you, called Bird. All right, and this is when the scooter industry was taking over the world. Right in 2018, I think it was. That was a really really fun time. I went from a company that was essentially minting money at the time, right, and Meta, to a company that had like no money,
Yeah.
and so was and it was a weird move, I think, to some of my peers and even my own family. I'm like, why would you leave such a powerful and strong company to go to something like that? And my desire to move organizations as much as I have, for the most part, has been around a desire to learn, right, and expand my own skill sets. And so was really comfortable working in a large tech environment. But how do you then operate in a company that was, I don't know, a couple hundred employees at the time, and really really different? Got brought on board there to be the GSOC manager, quote unquote, but then really that evolved into kind of head of security, head of scooter recovery, which got really interesting.
Yeah. I've heard, cause I just read like the
yeah,
stories, and we don't have to go into that, but
oh my
the
gosh,
scooter recovery stories are the best stories that exist out there.
unbelievable. And you wouldn't believe what people, this was back before even Bird was building their own proprietary scooters, right? So they were buying these from China, shipping them over. We would switch out the chip in them, put what we called a bird brain in them, and we would release them into the market. And some interesting things really happened. One is people would steal them, right, and try to convert them and sell them for a few $100. They would
Yeah.
hoard them, and then we inadvertently created a turf war from people trying to like charge them and get the $10 or whatever Bird would pay them for the night. And so was it really working with your organization as well as private investigators and law enforcement to try and get those back? And the way that Bird approached this, and I really think fondly of my time at Bird, so I don't want this to be viewed in any negative light, but was that Bird was all about disruption, right? It was like,
Yeah.
dump all these scooters out, let's disrupt the industry, which I think is very startup mentality, very interesting. But at the same time, it also upset, I think, government agencies and law enforcement, saying like these were a nuisance, not like some
Yeah.
sort of benefit add to the community, right? And so that became challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the stories were, going to storage centers and finding hundreds of birds, locked up there. We had people jumping over fences trying to get them back. We were setting up sting operations to get, how much of this was organized crime started to become a thing. We started to get some weird, quasi threats towards us about disrupting all of that. So that was a really, really interesting time, but I learned a ton there, right? I learned how to operate with very little, how to get very scrappy, how to make sure that you're making an impact, not wasting resources. I went from having a team around me to it was just me and really consultants. And eventually I think I got two other guys to help me out internally.
Yeah.
So things were going well there until the pandemic. Essentially, turns out people don't want to ride scooters to closed businesses.
Right.
And so it was unfortunately part of the layoff there. And then landed at Cruise, where things really exploded in terms of building my career quite a bit, right? Was able to build a GSOC program from the ground up. And Cruise was doing autonomous vehicle, robo-taxis, if you will, for primarily the United States. And so was able to help build a team there that was not only just focused on the core physical security and intelligence and investigations and some executive protection stuff that was built into that, but going back to that business enablement piece is something I was really, really proud of. Those lessons I had learned from Meta, I was able to actually carry over to Cruise. Things like if there is construction on a street, if there's a road closure, if there's some sort of all hazards event, water main breaks, shootings, violent crime, robberies, whatever it may be, we were able to provide that information in real time to our operations partners to ensure that not only were our vehicles safe, but ultimately our customers, right? And so that's where that business enablement piece came in. We had this peace of mind that we were trusted, that we had really strong systems and procedures and people in place to be able to ensure the business was moving forward appropriately. there was an unfortunate accident that happened at the end of 23 that really wasn't Cruz's fault, but ultimately led to some additional layoffs. And I had an opportunity to move over to Stripe, where I spent a little bit of time, and that was fun and interesting. But recently landed at Netflix, right where I am now. So um, really, really interesting stuff. I've bounced around, really focused on building GSOC programs, finding business enablements, and having folks understand how critical that can be to the success of the industry as a whole.
Awesome. God, well, thank you for walking us through it. So I don't. What's interesting, and you and I talked about this before I hit record, is that you were going to list off all these names of companies, and people are going to know.
Yeah,
It's not often that people know like everywhere you like oh, that's a household. And I'm just saying like security
yeah,
people, right? If I take this list and I'm like, hey, have you ever heard of these? It's going to be almost everyone, right? You're going to Netflix, Stripe, Cruise, Bird, Meta, Facebook, Google, right? So you said something super interesting that I want to
sure,
extrapolate from there. Well, there's a lot of things, and so I'll go through them one by one. But one was like, some people look at and again, I look at my resume over the last, since I went from, well, everyone asks me, you were a security director at a Fortune 50 company, and then you went to
right,
work in sales for an access control manufacturer. And I said, yeah, because I wanted to learn how to sell
right.
because so everyone said I was crazy, right? And you're the first person who's ever uh, articulated intentional career development the same way that I think about it,
Mm,
where it's like fail by design, meaning
right.
like I'm sure those first couple of days at Bird, you were like, what did I get myself into, right? And and
Yeah,
and
you
and
nailed
here's
it.
the thing, man. You're probably, I mean, we talked before about like the challenging, like what the first 2 months of Netflix was, right? Like, and we
Yes,
can
yeah,
dabble about that if we want to, but in a good job, in my opinion, in a good job, when you get in there, the first 6 months, you should be like, whoa, there should be like, it's almost like you should go through the five, the cycle of grief where you're like excited and then you're like, oh
yes.
shit, I'm in over my head. What did I do? You're questioning yourself, looking at other jobs to be like, am I going to fail here? Do I
Yeah,
need to start
yeah.
about it?
Did I
Right?
make a
Like,
mistake?
yeah, go through that. And then you're like, no, then you're like, okay, I won today. Let me try to do that again tomorrow. And then
Right.
and then
Find your
soon you
impact.
start building, and then you're like, yes, I get it. And you build the vision. And especially when you're, and I bet you felt this way at Cruise, where you go in and you're like, all right, you're the guy. Go. And you're
Yeah.
and you're literally charting your own adventure. And so when you look through
Yes.
those stops that you had along the way about being led, then leading others, then building it on your own, then trying something different like that. One, it takes, I think, a confidence in your own capability to say, if this all falls apart, I can figure something out. Like I
Exactly.
have the capabilities here. And then knowing that there's always something more to learn. And that, in my
Hmm.
opinion, and again, personal opinion here, um, the world of 20 years with one company and pensions and like loyalty, you know, we're way beyond that. And what's interesting where you've landed
Yeah.
now in Netflix is there's no company who believes in meritocracy more than Netflix, who literally wrote the book on high performance. And Reed
Yep.
Hastings, I love listening to him talk about the early days where he says like we're not a family, we're a high performing team.
You're
And
a team.
like,
Exactly.
right, and like just the language that they use, I
Hmm.
love everything about it. So anyway, I just wanted to like bang that drum with you a little bit because that it resonated with me so much. But let's talk about that a little bit more, like your thoughts on intentional growth and seeking it out,
Yeah.
either by seeking jobs or like education and growth while you're in your role. Like one, how has that been impactful for you over your career? Because I assume it has. And then
Sure.
two, like how would you talk to, that really funny is that I went to school for criminal justice. I was going to be law enforcement. I went
There you
through the
go.
same experience and had an internship and was like, this is not for me.
Yeah.
And so, that's still, as much as we think we have very unique stories, a lot of us have that similar, like that, I had that vision and then it wasn't right, but I still, and it's the same thing is that my mission has always been have a positive impact and help people. And I've always stayed tied to that. Even since I was in the army when I first came out of high school,
Right.
like it was like I have a calling to help support impact, keep people safe, do
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So it's very interesting because that resonates with me too. But anyway, personal development, education, like kind of maybe where does that come from? Is it something you've always been wired that way? Was that like postgraduate college, like part of
Yeah.
college development? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I could probably answer it a few different ways. I mean, some things that come to mind is like I came from, two, fairly successful parents who, run a large company themselves, and I've always been interested in kind of higher education. And so part of
Mm,
that was this almost like ingrained need into me to be like help make them proud to a certain extent,
right.
right? Get an advanced degree. Like I don't have an advanced degree beyond a bachelor's degree. So I have the bachelor's degree I mentioned earlier. I don't have a master's or anything like that. I do have a CPP through ASIS, which I'm very proud of as well. I'm a firm believer, though, that personal growth and development is on me to help drive whatever
Mm,
that looks like. And
yeah.
so I think some people, overly rely on the organization they're in to provide them with opportunities to be able to say, "Hey, I really want to grow into becoming an investigator. Or I really want to go into EP. How can you help me do that?" And most of the organizations I've been a part of, right there, it's I would say that it's not a primary function of the organization to ensure that you're getting the growth you need, right? You're there to do a job. You're there to provide impact. Now, there's going to be opportunities along the way that you need to be able to seize those opportunities when they come. I'm a big fan of getting your foot in the door, making tons of connections. One of the things I've always really focused on through my entire career, and how, like, I know you, is making strong networking connections,
Mm,
right? I do go to, at least a couple conferences a year, the GSOCs, the ISC West, things like that. Part of the reason is just to make sure like I'm seeing people, right?
mm,
Like, hey, what are you up to? Oh, you're doing that. We should connect. Like, there's an initiative I want to talk about. That is all really, I think, um, potentially understated by other folks in the industry. And when we talk about like working at startups and things like that, I think it's important to think about what are these new technologies that are coming on board, and not being afraid to make bets that way. Ultimately, you have to have confidence in yourself. We've talked about that. You have to have confidence in your abilities, but you also don't want to make up the fact that you think you're an expert in everything. I would not say I'm an expert in everything, nor would I almost like want to be, right? I know a lot about a bunch of different things. I know how to network well. I know how to work with people well. If you think you can do anything in this industry alone, you're foolish, I think, right? You need to be able to make those connections. And whether that's from I always bucket things into kind of like people, processes, and technology for me.
mm,
The people aspect of this is something that I think gets overlooked, right? A lot of people focus on, especially in GSOC environments, processes, right? Very important, standard operating procedures, protocols, all things that you need to have. The technology then kind of comes with that, right? Your technology helps influence those protocols. But if you're not networking with the right people and helping yourself grow that way and expose yourself to different things that way, that's going to be detrimental to how you grow in your career. Like I went from, traditional social media tech companies, Google and Meta, right, to then like almost like transportation type stuff with
mm,
Bird and Cruise. And now I'm on this like entertainment production stuff with Netflix that I'm just learning, really. But I
yeah.
knew it was one of those things like, hey, I don't know much about that industry, but I know that's a booming industry. I know it's important. I know there's practices and skill sets that I could take from my former organizations and bring them here, while learning and expanding my own mindset on how to be able to ensure that we're ultimately helping mitigate risk. And that's what I think it all points down to is how are you mitigating risk, whether it's to people, to executives, to the company, to the mission, right? It's not just looking at threats, which I think, risks and threats get often mixed up, right? I
Mm,
view the simplistic version of this is really thinking that risk equals threat times probability. There's a million different formulas out there on that, but there's a threat that there's a plane that's going to crash into where I am right now, right? But the risk is fairly low because the probability of that's happening pretty low. You want to make sure that you're addressing and forming the program around the risks towards the organization that are higher, right? And being able to kind of perform that cycle. So I'm touching on a million different things there, but you just kind of seeing where my brain is. But really, just
yeah.
making sure I'm staying on top of trends, staying on top of meeting with people, and understanding, ultimately remembering what you're there for, and then naturally some of those um, some of those opportunities around growth will come naturally as long as you're not afraid to seize it. I think a lot of people as well, they get comfortable or they're afraid to take a risk, right? And if you're kind and if you're driven, people generally speaking want to work with you and have the same goals in mind. So that's kind of my million thoughts on those points.
Yeah, it's so well said. And you said something in there that I want to tease out around like these kind of categories uh of operation that you've gone through, and maybe intentionally or maybe things just kind of
Sure.
transition that way where it's like, bird inevitably leads to cruise because it's kind of like startup transportation,
Hmm.
Google and Meta, a lot of people, they're a similar company. So you have this tech, and then looking at your time leaning forward into Netflix and being like,
Hmm.
I haven't done that yet. That would be new and interesting for me to learn.
Yes.
And I think too often people like, unless you've worked in like sales or worked in more like company operations, right? If you've been close enough
Right.
to, and I think you have because you talk the language of the business. I'm taking notes while you're speaking, things like business ROI, business enablement. You don't I think what I'll say our generation, this is
Sure.
I'm not talking age, I'm talking mindset. Our
Okay.
generation of security practitioner understands the necessity to speak the language of the business.
Yeah.
That no longer, well, that um I don't think there was ever a time where security could exist for security's sake. Um
Sure.
and that the as perceived risk, and I'll say perceived risk, has gone up,
Right.
the acknowledgement of adding security and security technology and security people, processes, and everything has also gone up. And so,
Right.
but if you don't want to ride this whipsaw of the fiscal cycle, meaning
Hmm.
you're spending too much on security, cut 20%, like I did
Right.
early in my career in the early, 2010, 11, 12, 13, then you
Hmm.
have to show some level of we are a cost center. So how can we do business enablement?
Yeah.
So if you're not paying attention to that, you often, I think, then look at like, well, I do security in transportation. I do security in
Yeah.
critical infrastructure. You kind of
You're
pick
getting
your
too
lane,
bucketed
right? And you
almost.
become
Right.
an expert in like a vertical versus saying, like, how can I like just collect this knowledge and capability that can be universally
Yeah.
applicable anywhere? And that's why I have adopted, I was a very early adopter of ESRM before
Yeah.
I even knew what it was called. And maybe just risk management, right? Like just the general principles, like you've already articulated, to say my number one job is to limit or mitigate the risk of the business
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
create a repeatable positive day, right? Because bad shit's gonna happen, but can I limit it so that everyone can go
Hmm.
to work and get paid and go home and we can ship our product and do all that stuff, right? And so that's the pivot point that was like instrumental in my unlocking of my complete like development as a security
Really
practitioner, was
interesting.
to say
Yeah.
my job is to create an uneventful day, and my
Yeah.
job is to enable the business. And so I tell the story that early in my security leadership career, I was like 1 month into my first security management job, and we had a laid off employee come back and shoot himself in our parking lot.
Oh
and
gosh.
and the likelihood that he was going to come in, I mean, I believe based on all the circumstances that came to light afterwards, his intent was to cause mass harm, and he decided not to. It was lunch hour.
Mm.
There were hundreds of employees walking out. I
Oh,
mean, it was, and he, for whatever
opportunity.
reason,
Yeah.
at the last minute, he and I have theories, but I won't go into my
Sure.
theories, that something happened that said, nope, I'm not going to do this, just my own life. Now, the CEO came over to me and said, basically, blank check. What do you want to do?
Yeah.
And right. And so I could have
There's that
said,
aspect of never letting a good crisis go to waste. I mean, it sounds
right.
callous, but at the same
Yeah.
time, I mean, that does help move things forward. Absolutely.
But if I would have said, all right, put all the cameras in, I want armed guards, I want, we need to lock it down,
Hmm.
the business would have came to a grinding halt. There's no way,
Yeah.
right? So in my head,
Too many
I
walls.
said,
Yeah.
go read the report that I submitted 2 weeks ago and do that stuff, because that's all we really need, right? It was like the security risk assessment that I already done was
Right.
adequate to the threat that I had identified. I also asked, how long has this company been in business? Almost 100 years. How many times has this happened? This is the first time.
Well,
Okay,
there you go.
so
Yeah.
likely, like, yes, but let's not let recency bias impact us of the
Fair.
likelihood and impact of this taking place. So taking I didn't know what to call it at the time. I didn't have the words.
Sure.
It was like,
And it's
I just
evolved,
feel
right?
right. Yeah. And so now it's more of a programmatic process. But so
Hmm.
I used it to say, like, let's do the stuff I already recommended, and let's make sure, like, to a best of our ability, this doesn't happen again, while also saying this shit could happen tomorrow. Like,
Yeah.
we just don't know, and we can't do, if we try to eliminate the risk, the business can't exist. So we have to
Yeah.
mitigate it
So
to a level of business operation acceptance.
absolutely. I think that's so critical, understanding the business and understanding. I've heard something last year that has really stuck with me too, is that, a well-run security department internally is one of the most connected
Mm,
departments throughout an organization. And HR maybe, and maybe IT maybe, kind of that,
yeah.
but the different levels of partnerships horizontally that you have to make throughout an organization is second to none, I think, to security. And because of that, what you're able to do is make these super strong connections, and not just with the people at a personal level, which is always fun and getting to know individuals, but they know what you're trying to do, and you know what
Mm,
they're trying to do, and helping highlight risk. You're helping highlight opportunity. And so when there is a concern, right, using that example, like, maybe this person, obviously I don't know any cases, details of the case, but maybe this person was showing tons of distress before they left, right? But they didn't know who to
hmm
reach out to internally. And being able to understand and help take that information and evaluate what the perceived risk or what the actual risk is will then help an organization move forward. To your point, it's not all about gates, guns, and guards. I mean, and this is also industry specific too. I haven't worked at like an oil, company where I
right.
think that is very, very important, right? And I don't want to undermine that by any means. But at the same time, just because you're throwing more cameras up, more guards at the doors, there's a factor of, the three Ds, right? Deter, detect, deny. I think that's great to a certain extent, but really looking internally, which starts at the management level, is so critical to being able to ensure that you are helping not just mitigate risk, but push that business forward. If you're not able to make those connections, I mean, I used to joke around with some colleagues. I haven't done as much recently, and I think actually this is probably a good thing where I think the industry is going as a whole, is that there. When I really started going to these, various conferences that we were talking about earlier, I used to joke around that there were a lot of dinosaurs in the industry, right? A lot of people who had, oh, I've been doing this for 30 years, and this is how we do security, and kind of tried and true, and then I come in and I go, that doesn't make sense, and they're kind of like, who the heck are you? What have you done? And kind of age going out the window to a certain extent, but really just been like, well, have you thought about it this way? Why haven't you made connections this way? And kind of challenging in an appropriate and respectable manner to some peers in the industry. But I think I'm seeing more and more of that at these conferences, which is great. I said I'm not joking about that nearly as much anymore, because I do think there's this
Yeah.
mindset and acceptance from organizations that, like, these programs are needed, right? Just because nothing's gone wrong doesn't mean that the budget should go down. It actually means things are working, right? And it all goes back to how
Right.
are you, showing that ROI? How are you communicating with leaders to show that you are a critical part of the organization?
Yeah, and I think that's the not like not resting on your laurels, right? And having a plan and a vision, and what um what things are supposed to look like. Um and uh and developing, just like, and knowing that it's just like, I'm not just waiting around and hoping bad stuff doesn't happen.
Right.
Um and and being able to articulate that, and I do think, that is the transition we're seeing more business minded people into security
Totally.
positions, and that is it's great to see. It's a lot of easier
Hmm.
conversation to have now, and you're right, you're not having that same kind of old school, like, and again, I think part of it too, kind of coming up and participating in that, as we collectively become the veterans in the industry, and we have that never finished mindset
Yeah.
of, like, continue to grow and develop. It helps continue to push a lot of that forward,
Yes.
and kind of keep that from being a part of the trap, I guess. Um,
Yeah,
So,
it's really interesting. It's you just spark like to even think that eventually we'll become the veterans of the industry is something like I hadn't
yeah.
even like crossed my mind. Like, oh gosh, like yeah, I guess that's right. At some point, I continue to think of myself as a disruptor to a certain extent, which I think is great in some ways. But I also recognize that I am being asked to do things like podcasts. I'm being asked to speak on panels and help influence and all super exciting stuff, but that will continue to evolve. Like, I also don't want to pretend that like what I'm saying now is going to be relevant 10 years from now, like the conversation about
Hmm.
AI coming into security. Like, I'm just starting to wrap my head around that, right? And how is that going to be useful? And not even a conversation that was remotely taking place 5 years ago. So really keep making sure you're staying on top of those trends and and obviously world events. We do live in a different world now than we did 5 years ago with some of this stuff, right? What are the risks that are important to different organizations change? I think the perceived risk piece is really interesting. It's something I'm going to start saying more because it's different what is being perceived versus what we're measuring, and how are you communicating those differences becomes really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of switching gears here a little bit.
Sure.
One of the things that I think is often unique for security leaders is the willingness um, to try new technology. And there's
Yeah.
pros and cons to it, right? There are uh, there's the opportunity to, the kind of the basic stance is use stuff that works, use stuff that's
Sure. Tried and true.
tried and true, right? But then you get the same, those legacy companies tend not to innovate. They kind of play safe
Slow.
on the roadmap, um, and it just like, so there's that's the other side to it, right? Now, you and I's worlds collide when I worked at Hivewatch and you were at Cruise and I was in
Hmm.
product, and we were working on some neat and interesting things that were very
Yeah.
unique and specifically driven by some of the requests that you guys put in. So tell me a little bit of your thoughts on that around, taking chances on startup technology. Obviously, having worked at a startup, there's probably a little bit more of like kinship there around, knowing
Sure.
what the benefits are, but like, what do you see of kind of the pros and cons and usefulness on that, and how
Yeah,
that would
it's
work?
it's um it's a loaded topic, I think, depending on who you're talking to. And there's definitely this perceived kind of antagonism towards startups I think, in the security industry, in the sense that, like, oh, there's, the big companies that know what we're doing, and you're disrupting something that, we have this figured out, kind of going back to that dinosaurs analogy I was making earlier. For me, it goes back to what the need is, right? So ultimately, when I was at Cruise, like, our biggest need was that we were building a GSOC that was using different camera systems, different access control systems, right, to perform any simple workflow, right, required an operator to go in and out of 4 or 5 disparate systems that weren't super user friendly and they needed to become, a subject matter expert in that. And really, it came, going to Hivewatch and saying, listen, the term PSIM, right, in the industry is a little bit of a dirty term, right, and so I don't. And that's something that's also tough, is like when you start
Hmm.
pitching the idea that, oh, we need some sort of PSIM type thing, people go, oh gosh, because I've actually implemented also the traditional PSIM type stuff at former organizations. And it takes an army to maintain, it takes forever to get stood up. By the time you stand it up, there's already some new capability or change or internally within the company where that need is evolved, right? And so being able to move quickly with an organization, I think, is really key. So what I really look for when I'm working for startups are a few different things. One is, are they willing to actually partner with me, right? Not to say that my word is be all end all in terms of where the roadmap should go, and I recognize I'm not the only customer for a young tech company that way. But at the same time, I'm highlighting needs that are very likely needs of other organizations as well. And so, are you able to actually partner with me and my team to be able to understand what capabilities are working, what aren't? Really, feedback cycles are super important. Even things as granular like, hey, that button should be moved here on the screen, or hey, it doesn't, when I click on this, it actually blocks this other thing that I need to make sure I'm
Yeah.
monitoring. Your screen real estate becomes an important thing within a GSOC, and
Mm.
being able to help understand that you have these systems up that are the most critical towards whatever need is happening at the time. So the partnership with those organizations, I think, becomes the most important part. Are you able to, if I pick up the phone and I call the CEO, which I did at iWatch a few times,
Yeah.
and I love Ryan to death, but he was great in saying, like, they're actually going to listen to you, right? Some of these other larger organizations, don't have that level of flexibility or level of kind of like
Mhm.
white glove service boutique piece that you're actually listening to your concerns with something, right? Especially if something is critical or something's broken or something's not working well, or if it was a weird meeting for whatever reason and we're stuck, right? How are we actually going to be able to come over these hurdles together? I think that is the most important piece. Obviously, it being user friendly is another super important aspect of it as a whole. I always use the terminology of iPhone simple or iPhone stupid
Yeah.
with these things, in the
Yeah.
sense that if you give a kid an iPhone for the first time, they kind of figure it out. It's kind of this
Hmm.
miraculous thing if you ever watch it in real time. Like, oh yeah, they swipe, they click, they know what they're doing, they know how to move things around. I want that same level of comfortableness with my operators or analysts when they're using a system like this. There's always a degree of training that needs to happen. There's always different protocols that need to be built into the system as a whole. But if they can get into it and kind of know how to operate it right away, you've won half the battle, right? You don't have to go click through multiple different menus to get to this one specific functionality. Having those things kind of pop up for an operator become key. It all comes back to efficiency, right? If I'm able to show through some piece of technology that ultimately I am saving money on future operators having to be in place as the organization continues to scale, that's a win, right? And that shows, straight going back to that business argument and understanding the business. Everyone understands money, right? And so if I'm able to understand, show that like, hey, if we spend this money up front, but over the course of the next 5 years by doing this, I'm actually going to save, to maintain this level of service, right? That we can get through this. If you wanted that level of service, you love us being able to respond to alarms in under 2 minutes. Awesome. Here's how we'll do that without adding 10 million more dollars to the budget.
Right.
That's what speaks volumes to leaders initially, right? And then because of that, right? And that's just the beginning of the argument. And that's how I've built these business cases. Yeah, okay, great, you're saving money, but ultimately what you're doing is increasing capacity for a security operations center that way, right? If you're able to respond to an important alarm in under 2 minutes, you're freeing up all this additional bandwidth to be able to handle crises or customer service workflows, right? Going back to that business enablement piece, because a GSOC environment is so tied in with the rest of the business, those you can gradually expand it to be more of like an enterprise operation center. It doesn't just have to be security, right? Can you field in service requests from facilities? Can you help the infosec team with other alerts or alarms that they may have? There's a fine line there, and being able to ensure that you're still ultimately addressing the risk at hand for the organization and why you're there. But if you're able to, through this technology, be able to show that you're going to increase your capacity and ultimately save some money down the line, you win. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think the flexibility and capability of having that at your disposal, um, it it goes a long way, and it means a lot. And again, like there's just, and I'd say, startup, enterprise, like legacy business aside, whatever, the ability to have
Sure.
folks that will listen to the needs of their customer and
Yes.
drive change and
Everything.
create a product that is geared towards a high level of engagement and customer usage, like that, regardless of the size of your business, that, that's what matters. And when you look outside of the
Absolutely.
security industry, and you've worked for many of these companies that you've listed, they have that capability. So like, it's
Mhm.
a fallacy to assume that size of company negates ability to respond in that
Great
effective
point.
way. Yeah.
Great point. And that's probably bias on my own. And you're so right. If an organization will, startups grow into large companies when they're successful that way, right? When they're able to continuously listen to their customers and take that feedback into consideration, that engine changes because it just gets bigger. But that's such a great point. I work with other large companies in the space that I love working with because of that, right? They're able to
Hmm.
listen, they spend the time with you. It's not a set it and forget it thing, right? They don't
Right.
sell you something and then you never hear from them again, right? And so, great point there. And I definitely don't want my comments to be misconstrued as, oh, he's biased just towards startup companies. No, not at all. I recognize that there's these larger companies that I continue to work with to this day exist for a reason as well, right? And there's just a degree of catch up, I think, that's happening in the industry to be able to ensure that they're meeting customers' needs as well as staying on top of new technologies and ideology that's coming to the front.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think when you look at our industry, it is more common, more likely, and more routine that the startup and the smaller companies have those attributes. And then
Totally.
what I think is that the legacy companies could do that if they chose to. They choose not to, and there's various reasons that because of that we get into that. But I
Sure.
think what is shown by other companies that are not in our industry who are huge, who do still maintain those attributes, is that
Hmm.
it's possible regardless of size, and especially with, I think, much more complicated technologies and nuanced things. I mean, again, look where you're at right now with Netflix, and kind of they started shipping DVDs, and now the
Yeah.
amazement of what they are today as a company is completely unbelievable. And so
Yeah,
they're
it's a
they're a,
different
they're
risk
a
now than
yeah.
it was at other places. It's a great point, right? I think security for so long was largely like, oh, you got your cameras, you got your access control, you have a way to dispatch, and you have a way to document some incidents to maybe some investigators. Great, you're kind of good to go. The needs and risks are evolving, right? You nailed it on the head, right? Netflix went from a DVD shipping company, right, to oh, we're going to go to a streaming company, to now it's actually this evolution of like, now we're a full-blown like production company, and other like live experiences are coming, right? That risk profile changes every single time, so you need to be able to partner with folks in the security industry to be able to address those risks and evolve that as time goes on. And that really goes back down to like these individual connections that are being made, staying on top of the different technologies, going to these conferences, doing podcasts, like all these things I think are so critical to be able to ensure that you're like making that network really strong.
So in that way, as we kind of wrap things up here, like what are recommendations that you have for well, anyone in the industry, but folks just getting started, or folks
Yeah.
looking to kind of reach that next level in their career, what are the things, one or two things that you think are really things that they should focus on or work on as far as for their continued development?
Yeah, great question. I could probably answer this a million different ways. The things that come to mind up front is always have an open mind, right? If whether it's an idea or an organization that reaches out to you, make sure that you have an open mind about who you're speaking to, and listening to their perspective on something coming in. You may not always agree with it, right? And that's fine, but you have an open mind and you're listening. Being able to also making sure that you really enjoy the work that you're doing, I think is super critical. It is so easy in security in particular to burn out. Right, you're
Mm,
constantly dealing with the negative, right? You're constantly having to deal with crises or people that need help, or maybe they're emotionally stressed out, so maybe they're being unreasonable at that moment, or you're dealing with an executive who doesn't understand what you're doing, and budgets, like all this stuff can be really taxing on an individual. I've burnt out, absolutely. Like I've come at
mm,
points where you get to this point where you're like, I don't care, right? And if you get to that point where you don't care, something's wrong there. Maintaining a really healthy work-life balance, I think, is extremely key, and that really helps by working, if you can, work for an organization that you believe in, or a leader that you believe in. Right?
mm.
I really seek out organizations that I believe in the leaders, I believe in the mission, that you're immediately tied into that, because then the work you're doing ultimately helps enable that, right? And then you're able to enjoy it yourself with whatever that company is doing is their mission. So being open minded, making sure that you're working for towards or for an organization or leader that you really believe in, and staying. I mentioned this a few times throughout this so far. Staying on top of trends, staying on top of what are these kind of interesting features in the industry, because those who are able to stay on top of those are the ones whose voices become louder along the way. So those are my
Yeah,
kind of three top tips and tricks, if you will.
I love it. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for your time today. It's been just a fantastic conversation, sharing your background, kind of your interests, your areas of focus, your advice for others in the industry, and kind of giving those of us with non-traditional backgrounds who looking to find and blaze their
Yeah.
own path in the industry, a bit of a roadmap on how that could look. So, thank you so much for everything. I appreciate your time. Best of luck with your continued success in your new-ish role, and just hope all good things.
Thank you, John. This has been a blast. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Let's go do great things.
Yeah, let's do it.